el Departamento del Tesoro de los Estados Unidos de América ha publicado una licencia amplia para la producción, la comercialización, la exploración, la venta, la exportación de petróleo de Venezuela, es decir, se levanta la sanción.
Sanctions relief at last. The U.S. Treasury Department issued a 6-month license allowing production, investment, and sale in the Venezuelan oil, gas, and gold sectors, a move classified by the Venezuelan government as the suspension of sanctions. The announcement came on the heels of an agreement signed between the Nicolás Maduro government and the U.S.-backed Unitary Platform establishing certain conditions for the 2024 presidential elections. Sanctions easing is undoubtedly a positive development, but we should proceed with caution. The announcement by the U.S. Treasury Department was riddled with latent threats, saying they were prepared to amend or revoke authorizations at any time should the Biden administration unilaterally determine that the Venezuelan government has not followed through on agreements. No country should have to go through a licensing process with the U.S.-based Office of Foreign Assets Control to sell their own resources. At the time of publishing, relations between the U.S. and Venezuela had not yet been normalized, and Venezuelan state entities have not regained access to U.S.-based bank accounts, which adds logistical obstacles to any transaction. At the end of the day, the White House is still seeking regime change in Venezuela. They've just adjusted their strategy. Ultimately, only the Venezuelan people should decide their destiny and government. Make no mistake, this is a victory for the Venezuelan people and a tribute to their perseverance and resistance against imperialist aggression. Venezuela and its people were not subdued by Washington's war against them. Instead, a valiant people, committed to their emancipatory process, found inventive ways to survive and continue building an innovative socialist project. Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. On today's episode, we present to you 2 new books on Venezuela. The first is A War Without Bombs, The Social, Political, and Economic Impact of Sanctions Against Venezuela, written and published by the Venezuelanalysis team. The book is now available to everyone to download for free on our brand new website. The world must not be allowed to forget that Washington set out to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution. In recent years, relying on an all-out economic war against Venezuela with a weapon of choice, unilateral coercive measures, commonly known as sanctions. The book features essays, infographics, and interviews with expert analysts to expose the mechanics of sanctions, their impact, and the geopolitical implications. It likewise features testimonies of popular resistance from Bolivarian grassroots organizations. On today's program, we'll also look at Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal movement and its Socialist Project by Chris Gilbert, professor of political studies at the Universidad Bolivariana de Venezuela. Chris talks to us about the place of communes in Venezuela's Socialist Project, as well as their place as a site of struggle and resistance against the U.S. economic blockade. But first, a conversation with Venezuelanalysis Cira Pascual Marquina about the thinking behind a book on sanctions and the stories within that detail what working people in Venezuela are doing to build a socialist alternative in a country under siege. Hi, Cira. Thank you for joining us. The preface to the book starts with the following, quote, "Ever since the 1998 election of Hugo Chavez, Washington has been trying to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution. In recent years, regime change efforts have mostly relied on an all-out economic war against Venezuela, with a weapon of choice, unilateral coercive measures, commonly known as sanctions. A War Without Bombs, The Social, Political, and Economic Impact of Sanctions Against Venezuela aims to provide Venezuelanalysis readers, internationalists, activists, and people committed to social justice with the tools to understand and collectively revert the devastating impact of the blockade on the people of Venezuela." End quote. As the member of the Venezuelanalysis team that drove this process behind the book forward, why did you feel motivated to document the impact of sanctions in this way? What role can this book play in reverting the impact of the blockade?
Thank you, José Luis. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be talking with you today about this book, A War Without Bombs, which is actually a collective effort of the Venezuelanalysis team. And it's particularly good for us to be doing this as we turn 20 years old as an outlet. We've been at it for 20 years. Venezuelanalysis has always documented the efforts of the Venezuelan people, of the grassroots, and of the Bolivarian government to build a sovereign and socialist alternative in Venezuela. So that has always been one of the legs that we've walked on. And then we walk on another leg, which basically documents the frankly restless efforts of US imperialism to overthrow the Bolivarian government and the Bolivarian revolution through coups, sabotages, paramilitary incursions, and eventually an all-out economic war against the people of Venezuela, because that's what sanctions are. And sanctions kill. They have killed tens or actually hundreds of thousands of people in Venezuela. So we thought it was very important that because we've been working on documenting this basically since 2015, which is when Obama released his decree declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat, and that's when sanctions begin. Since then, we've been documenting the efforts of the US government to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution via sanctions. So in 2015, there was the Obama decree. In 2017, the financial sanctions were set in place. In 2019, an oil embargo set in place. And that really was, really an intensification of this war against the Venezuelan people, because Venezuela is a country that historically had relied on oil exports for its economic activity. So it really had the sanctions, and specifically the oil embargo, had a devastating effect on our economy. So the consequences, as I was saying before, well, actually through 2020, some 100,000 people died. But right now, as we speak, there are 300,000 chronic disease patients without treatment, people who have chronic diseases who cannot access treatment. But there's also many other problems, like access to gasoline is really difficult because Venezuela is an oil producer. Access to diluents has become really complex because of the international sanctions on Venezuela. So that actually implies that production in Venezuela has gone down drastically, as well as, of course, imports. So with the book, we wanted to build a pedagogical tool, but also a political tool for the left and for people who care for humanity in general to understand the origin of the crisis that Venezuela is currently living, and hopefully to promote action from the readers, because, of course, in the global north, there are many people who maybe have heard about the sanctions, people on the left who are aware of them, but to understand the scope of it is actually important in order to promote action, political action. So that's our objective. And one of the interesting things about the book is that it's not only a quantitative narrative, which is good and necessary, but it also brings in a human factor. That's, I think, I would say, one of the virtues of the book. So, the book is there as a tool to educate and to bring about change.
Can you speak to us about the way the book is organized? What is each section about?
So the book is divided into 4 sections. The first section has articles and infographics that expose the mechanics of the sanctions. They delve into the real life impact, and they also look specifically at the sanctions on the oil industry, on Citgo, etc., etc. And this section also has an article on the mass media discourse that legitimates the sanctions, these deadly policies. This is important because the mainstream media basically builds these discourses that actually legitimate the deadly actions taken by the U.S. government, by the Department of Treasury, etc., etc. This section, as I was just saying, it also comes with infographics, and the infographics can help you kind of like get some of the big picture about the impact of the section. So some of the data that I was giving you in the earlier question comes. It's also related in those infographics. So that's the first section, and I would say it's like the section that you have to read if you need to get the basics on the sanctions. The second section brings together 3 interviews that we did with 3 experts and from the left that talk about the political, economic, and social impact of the sanctions, but they also have a geopolitical perspective. The people that we interviewed are Robert Patnaik, Alexander Main, and Gregory Gilbert. And why is it important to have a geopolitical perspective on the sanctions? Well, obviously, Venezuela is not the only country that is under siege by US imperialism via sanctions. Sanctions have become kind of like a weapon of choice by US imperialism to impose its agenda. Generally doesn't work. Of course, it's been set in place for against the people of Cuba for basically for decades, but in recent times, it's become really the most common form of trying to overthrow governments. The most common form that the US government applies to overthrow governments that it doesn't like. So having a geopolitical perspective on this is really important to understand the impact of sanctions on Venezuela and why sanctions are being applied. Well, one couldn't do that without understanding the whole world, no? And also without being solidarious with the other peoples of the world who are living under sanctions regimes. And the third section basically brings together Venezuelanalysis, specifically myself and Chris Gilbert. We have been working on an ongoing series of in-depth articles that is called Communal and Working Class Resistance. And basically, this is a collection of testimonies that unveils the impact of the US blockade on grassroots organization and how they, rain or shine, continue to build a post-capitalist society. So this is actually a section that is, and we'll talk more about it, this is actually a section that actually gives you hope, because no matter what US imperialism does, people still struggle, and not only do they struggle, but they build alternatives here. And the fourth section is a section that basically offers a glossary of terms that are important to know to navigate the whole kind of like network, the woven network of sanctions that the US imposes on Venezuela and on other countries. So to understand the difference between a primary sanction and a secondary sanction, what is overcompliance, what are targeted sanctions, to understand all these terms that at the end of the day kind of like oftentimes are there to kind of like erase the real impact of the sanctions. Well, this glossary should be useful. So it's kind of like a short but useful and educational tool in the book for our readers, and for, of course, anybody who's interested in trying to revert this imperialist form of making war, of doing the war against the peoples of the global south, against those who wake up and say, ya basta, no more.
You contributed heavily to the final section, where the book addresses what working people in Venezuela are doing to build a socialist alternative in the country under siege. In our next section, we're going to speak with Chris Gilbert about the hope that Venezuela's communes offers. Here, I'd like for you to tell us about the communities you've met and spoken with, what they're doing to build that alternative in these difficult circumstances. What can readers outside Venezuela take away from these efforts by the communards?
So in this series that I was saying before is called Communal and Working Class Resistance, our objective is on the one hand to understand how the sanctions actually have a real, tangible impact on the lives of Venezuelans who are building an alternative. But it also was important for us to make it be known that the working people of Venezuela are actually building a socialist alternative in a country under siege. I think this is super important. And it actually gives hope, I think, to those who will give hope to those who read the text, who read our book. So one thing that's important to know when we think about the situation in Venezuela is that, of course, the mainstream media always silences the impact of the sanctions on the people of Venezuela, and who could be surprised by that? But as it happens, it is also the progressive media that tends to focus on the other one hand, the policies of U.S. imperialism, but also it focuses on the actions of the Venezuelan government. And they tend to focus on the issue of sanctions, looking at it quantitatively, not qualitatively. Then there's another issue that personally has been concerning me for a long time, which is that when Venezuelans are actually portrayed in the media, and specifically in the progressive media, they are rendered as passive victims and not as subjects of transformation. Of course, everybody who's living in Venezuela is actually a victim of the US blockade. But are we just victims? Or is there something else here? And I think that, if you are committed to a justice, like a traditional conception of justice, we could say even a bourgeois sense of justice, you could focus exclusively on the human rights issues, and you could turn to NGOs and the UN to solve the problems. And that's fair. But from a revolutionary perspective, from a radical Chavista and left perspective, that's not enough. Basically, in Venezuela, there's a large percentage of the population that's committed to transformations. And to those in the global north, in the English-speaking world, that are committed also to profound transformations, I think it's important for those people to learn about the experiments of people in communes and in worker-controlled factories, to learn about them, to hear from them, because basically not only are we victims, but we are also building a new future here in this territory that we call Venezuela. And the lessons that people can get from them are many, are wonderful, and they are also full of hope. So we've published some 10 specials, and these specials are based on testimonials. We have incorporated 2 of these testimonial specials in the book. The first one is about El Panal Commune, and the second one is about Indorca, a metal mechanic factory in Puerto Ordaz in the south of the country. So let's take one at a time. El Panal Commune is a commune in Caracas in 23 de Enero, which is a working class and very rebellious barrio, a neighborhood. And it's interesting that El Panal Commune is actually the first territory that called itself a commune, actually already in 2006. In 2006, Chavez was talking about consejos comunales, communal councils, which were small, self-organized, assembly-based spaces where people took decisions on how to solve their problems together. And it was actually legislated. And we are talking about 2006. But the people from El Panal Commune were simultaneously reading about the Paris Commune, they were reading about Soviets, about the Chinese communes, and they said, well, let's not just do communal councils. Let's do something bigger. Let's do something that looks at the transformation of the society as a whole. Let's start with building a commune. So in 2006, they built an arch, an entry arch in the entrance of what we know as the commune, and they wrote on it. It's written on it. The archway is still there. It says, como una insurgente del Panal 2021. The Commune, what is the Commune? Like Chavez proposes socialism in 2006, but it's not until 2009 that he actually proposes that our way to socialism should be the Commune. The communes are, of course, not Chavez's invention. They're actually the synthesis of the whole Bolivarian process, but they are also the synthesis of the maroon and indigenous forms of organization that were highly democratic, basically communistic organizations that existed in resistance to Spanish colonialism. So the communes, while they may be linked to the Paris Commune in terms of their history, in terms of the imaginary, but they are also linked to actual, real, existing experiences of building, of organization in the Venezuelan territory and in the Latin American territory, of course, too. So there's another third element that comes into Chavez's reflection about the communes, which is his conversation with Meseros. Meseros more or less discovers or comes to the conclusion that the problem with East Bloc socialism was that the metabolism of capital persisted. In other words, that there wasn't a full democratization of society. So while there was no longer private ownership of the means of production, there still were hierarchical forms of organization. So that's a little bit kind of like a very brief synthesis of what's where the idea of the commune comes from. So Chavez, being with the Bolivarian process, being highly democratic, Chavez reflects with the Venezuelan people and with Meseros, and they collectively think about the Soviets and the Paris Commune and the Chinese communes, and they link all of that to the maroon and indigenous forms of organizations. And there's this marvelous creation, which is the Venezuelan commune. So the section about El Panal Commune basically has all this work that we've been talking about, this resistance work, this series of resistance, working class and communal resistance that we've been talking about. They all are based on testimonies. This one too is based on testimonies in which the communards and the cadres talk about the origin of the commune, which I was telling you about just before, like the commune being formed in 2006, but also going back further, how the communards in the prior organization, in the Fuerza Patriótica Alexis Vive, actually displaced the drug gangs from the territory to create a space where people could live and organize. So that's how they got the first cadres that would eventually form the commune. That's how they got moral authority. And they go into their form of organization. How does the communal model work at the El Panal? How the social property enterprises work. So at El Panal, there's a textile factory and a bakery and a packing plant and a pig farm and a greenhouse, etc., etc. All these means of production are under social property. What does this mean? Of course, it means that there's no individual property. They are not a cooperative either. These are means of production that are owned by the community. So it is the community that democratically in an assembly, which would be the highest form of organization of the commune, they collectively decide what they are going to produce, how they are going to produce it, and how they are going to distribute it. And, super important, what they are going to do with the excellent, with the surplus, rather. And finally, when we go into this section, in the section about the commune, the Panal Commune, we delve into issues like what is the impact of the sanctions on the commune, how has been production hurt, the kind of illnesses that people face, the problem with people migrating out of the country. But more important than that, one thing that we delve into in this section is how the people in the commune, how the communards organize, for instance, to deliver food to everybody. How they, before what we call the club, which is the state-run system for distributing food so that everybody in Venezuela has food, there was actually in the El Panal Commune and in other communes too, self-organized initiatives to buy and distribute foods to make sure that nobody was going hungry. We also learned about how they care for the community, how there's a popular canteen, how the commune kept the school open when there was no money to pay teachers or to keep the canteen open. The commune itself actually assumed those responsibilities and made sure also that Some of the poorest people had access to medicines, etc., etc. So basically, one of the most interesting things about this, about El Panal commune and all the communes that we have visited and we have lived in, which are a bunch by now, basically what commune shows is that in the present, a commune can give you actual solutions to the very serious problems that people face in a country under siege. And they do it while they also build a new set of social relations, not based on exploitation. So you can see in the commune both a solution to the present, but also the construction of a future, the building of a new socialist future. And then there's Indorca, and I will try to be brief because I did talk a long time about El Panal because it's very dear to my heart, but Indorca is also very, very dear to our hearts. Indorca is a metal mechanic factory serving the steel industry in Puerto Ordaz in the south of the country, in the kind of like the industrial hub of Venezuela. And this is a factory run by the workers, a factory without bosses, basically since 2015. How did this come about? Well, the history goes as follows. In 2012, during Chavez's presidency, a new labor law was passed. That was definitely a progressive labor law. And many owners of factories, many capitalists, went in an owner's strike at that time. So they basically fired all the workers, and many of them attempted to dismantle the factories that they had owned. What did the workers of Indorca, and by the way, of many other factories, do at the time? Well, basically, in the case of Indorca, for 2 years, they set a guard around the factory, protecting the premises and protecting the machinery. They did this, and they succeeded at maintaining most of the machinery in there. And after 2 years, the government gave the workers the right to re-enter the factory and to take democratic control of the factory and reactivate it and run it. And it's still running until today. As you can imagine, this process wasn't easy at all, because after 2 years of the factory being basically not producing, and also there were some attempts at sabotaging and actual sabotages by the thugs paid by the owner. So, but they were able to reactivate it with a lot of work and with a lot of collaboration from other workers in other factories. The most interesting thing about this factory today is that it's under democratic control. Basically everybody gets paid the same. Everybody takes decisions everybody participates in a monthly assembly where they go kind of like dollar by dollar, this amount of dollars came in, this amount of dollars went out. We have the possibility of taking this job, and it's voted together collectively if they'll take the job or not. They decide what to do with the excedent, with the surplus. They also decide what their wages are going to be, etc., etc. And all this is done in an assembly manner. So this is really extraordinary, because one of the things about Venezuela is that since the sanctions began, many factories have closed, both state-owned and also factories that were in the hands of private capitalists. In fact, I would say most of the factories closed down over the past few years. But that wasn't the case with Indorca, and I would argue that's because it is democratically owned that this factory didn't shut down. So then there's also in this section, we also delve into the impact of the sanctions, which has been huge. Of course, during the worst years of the sanctions, they were producing very little, but they also, this case study also shows us the great ingenuity of the working class. For instance, because of the sanctions, there's things like manifolds that cannot be imported from abroad, manifolds being kind of like mechanisms that are needed in oil wells to control the flow of oil. So these workers actually, from an old manifold, were able to recreate new manifolds. So it's really, really amazing what these people have been able to do. And they've been able to do it democratically. And as I was saying, and I really want to highlight this, they've been doing it in conditions that are so difficult that brought most factories to a shutdown because of lack of resources, of raw materials, because there was no gasoline for the workers to get to the centers of production, etc., etc. There's one, I will close with this. There's one thing that one of the workers in Indorca said was that I think is really important. You know, like when you are in a situation, when you're in a country under siege, of course, there's a temptation to kind of like take the pragmatic path. And the pragmatic path in a capitalist society is capitalism. But Cheo, this wonderful comrade, he said that actually the solution for Venezuela's problem is not less socialism, but more socialism. And I guess I would like to close with that because I think that what they've taught us is tremendous, is really important. And their voice is the one who should tell you, their voice is the one that's going to tell you most about it. That's why, once again, we encourage you to download the book, which is free. We also encourage you to support Venezuelanalysis because this work takes resources. We encourage you to distribute the book as well, to read it collectively. And, of course, we encourage you to do whatever action you can to make sure that there's an end brought to these really deadly sanctions that are imposed on Venezuela and on the people of many other countries in the global south.
Thank you so much for joining us. As always, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Independencia o nada, comuna o nada, ¿o qué es lo que hacemos aquí?
In our next segment, we will speak with Chris Gilbert, co-author of Venezuela, the Present of Struggle, and co-host of Escuela de Cuadros, a Marxist educational television program and podcast, about his new book, Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project, now available for monthly review.
Hello, Chris. Thank you for joining us here on the program. And, well, let's start at the beginning. I want to ask you, why did you put in the title of the introduction, putting the commune back into communism? What does that tell us about what this book is all about?
That's a good question, José Luis, and I'm happy to be back on your podcast. My book is titled Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project. I chose the title Putting the Commune Back into Communism for the introduction, partly with a view to Marx himself. If you think about Marx's work, I think that one of the blind spots that people have had is with regard to Marxism is the role of the commune in Marxist thought. In fact, communes were present in Marxist thought really almost from the beginning. Well, if you look at, for example, in Marxist writing from the 1840s, there's a great emphasis on self-emancipation. As early as 1843, there's a letter to Arnold Ruge in which he defends the idea of the self-emancipation of the working class. And then there are these statements in the mid-century in the Communist Manifesto in which he talks about the future society as an association of a free association of producers. And I always ask myself, what is that except for a commune? And then as we move forward, Marx talks in the Brundries manuscripts about communes in different societies, and in ancient Greek society, ancient Roman society, German tribal society, and in Asia. And he asks the question to the readers, or he poses the question, he says it's not surprising that people are joined with there. It means that communal means of production, but rather that they get separated from it. And then maybe better known is how later in his life, faced with the Paris Commune, Marx says that that's the form finally discovered for proletarian emancipation. And late in his life, he defends the Russian Commune in his letters to Vera Sasulik. And he also takes a great interest in indigenous forms of communal organization among the Iroquois and also among Algerian peasants. So I always ask the question to myself, why is it people pay so little attention to the Commune and Marx? And when I say putting the commune back into communism, I'm really looking at how the Venezuelan people, or maybe Latin Americans more generally, the Latin American popular movement, has, through an organic process, partly an organic process and partly through intellectual work, recovered the idea of communal organizing and put it back into communism. As far as like intellectual work, a stellar example would be Mariátegui, who talked about the Incans' practical socialism or practical communism. But perhaps more important for my book is the way the Latin American popular movement has partly relying, or in a great measure relying on indigenous traditions of self-governance or Maroon anti-slavery movement, have taken these communal traditions and shaped them into a current day project. In Venezuela, of course, this has a specific history. Chavez, of course, took participative and protagonistic democracy as one of his central programmatic points for the 20 or 30, almost 30 years of the Bolivarian process. If one thinks about Chavez beginning the Bolivarian process in the 1990s, and we can see how these ideas come into the movement and they gradually issue into the idea of the commune. When Chavez throws out to the public the idea of that the commune would be the basic cell of socialism in 2009, and that's followed quickly by the communal laws in 2010.
Yeah, and that kind of tells us a little bit about how this concept of the commune became, in many ways, the site within the Bolivarian Revolution, the Bolivarian process, where these ideas of socialism are actually best being realized and being put into practice, that sort of rescuing of some of the political ideas that have always been there from the beginning of the Bolivarian process. And in the book, you write, quote, self-organized communities around the country seized on the Communal project, end quote. So what is it about the Communal project, specifically in Venezuela, that made it appealing, that made it the site of struggle in the Venezuelan context? I think particularly given this present context where there's just a merciless economic blockade against the country.
Sure. That's a fascinating story. I always think that people don't often tell the truth about revolutions because both the revolutionaries and the counter-revolutionaries like to tell his story in a particular way, in a linear way. And that's actually not the right way of telling the story of the Bolivarian process, particularly with regard to the communal idea and the communal project. So I mentioned just now that Chavez threw out the idea publicly of building the socialism with communes as the basic cells in 2009. But to tell you the truth, that idea didn't really seize hold of the masses at that point. People, of course, all of us followed Chavez and took note of what he said and responded in some way or another. But the response was in great measure formalistic. People made communes of paper. The material conditions really didn't lend itself because of even the abundance from oil profits at that time. People were still looking to the state as a kind of assistentialist solution. So it's only if we fast forward 5 or 6 years later, when the crisis really hits, that people began to really make serious material, substantial communes. That's an interesting story. I often, or at least in the book, and often I recur to this idea of Marx when he says, an idea becomes a material force when it grips the masses. But the truth is, ideas don't become material forces until the masses grip them. I always like to turn the phrase around. And so it's when the masses gripped the idea of the commune in the mid-2010s, that it really took on force. In a way, people should take heart. People around the world can take heart on that idea. I mean, it was the worst of times, but also it was the worst of times for all of us in Venezuela. But in some ways, it was the best of times for communal organization, because that's when the project began to really take on substance. I say that people might take heart, people who hope to change the world might take heart in that idea. I often think of how Lenin, in the eve of what was turned out to be the eve of the Russian Revolution in early 1917, was talking to students, Swiss students, and he said he probably wouldn't see the revolution in his lifetime. And a few months later, he turned out to be wrong. So one doesn't really know when an idea will take hold in people. And the work people do now, even if times seem grim, might pay off later on downstream.
And so that helps kind of situate this moment for the communards inside Venezuela, that it's more so a response to what's happening materially inside of the country as a result of its contradictions with U.S. imperialism.
That's certainly correct, yes. The hand of imperialism has an important role in Latin American politics always. But of course, it's important to emphasize the agency people have. The agency people have through constructing, projecting, building. That's what my story is about in great measure. These days, of course, and one goes on thinking about how the sanctions have inflicted so much pain and death on Venezuelans. And it can fill one with anger. It can fill one with rage. But at the same time, what's impressive is that many people here have converted that rage or the material circumstances into a substantial project and have gone forward. It's that that my book is really about. At the same time, of course, I hope that by showing what people have done, showing what people have built here, showing the communal project and its gloriousness, its beauty, to put it that way, one can also put in sharper contrast the horror of the sanctions, the cruelness, the murderousness of them. That's part of my project. I focus on communal construction, but in the background, of course, is the hand of imperialism and the terrible fact of sanctions and interference.
Now, talking about the social relations that exist in these communes and these communal spaces, we've previously talked about some of your other work where you've talked a bit of the winding road that Chavez and the Bolivarian process kind of took, first talking about co-ops and also these social production enterprises and settling upon this idea of the commune. And you write, the essence of a commune is a new set of social relations, which are not usually immediate visible, end quote. Someone who spent a lot of time in these communes, among the communards, can you describe some of these social relations, these creations that are happening in these spaces, in these territories, and what sets them apart from other forms of bottom-up organization that we might see, say, something like a co-op?
That's a good question. I come very clear in what I see as the essential social relation being built in communes. In fact, I think one of the most important contributions of the book, and one never knows what the most important contribution is because one is so close to a work. But I think that one of the most important contributions is a theory or a hypothesis about what a socialist commune is. And so my hypothesis is that the essence, I say this in print, I say the essence of a commune, the essence of a socialist commune is democratically organized, directly social labor. That's kind of a mouthful, but what is directly social labor? Directly social labor is the idea that instead of a market, instead of our producing things for a market, and that are getting socialized through the impersonal mechanisms of the market, we as a community democratically decide what we're going to produce. The what, the how much. And of course, that has a huge change. It's key. I'd like to emphasize democratically organized because directly social labor exists in feudal societies, for example, was often the case in feudal societies, but it wasn't, of course, democratic. That has a huge change on how people, that effectively should end exploitation and it should end alienation. Because those are generated, in the case of alienation and exploitation, they have everything to do with the forms of wage labor that exist in our society. It also has the second extremely important aspect, and this is, I think, part of the contribution that I make to the theorization of communes, is that as we know in our society, half or more than half of the work is unpaid labor, unpaid social reproductive labor, the work of care, the work of the household work that is often underpaid or often unpaid, perhaps underpaid. It's often carried about by women, and it's generally undervalued. This kind of labor, the communes also should convert all of this labor into the democratically, directly social labor, and it should take labor out of the household, socialize it, and therefore in the hierarchy that exists in capitalist society between so-called productive labor, that would be wage labor, and the social reproductive labor that it consistently undervalues. And that's why I think communes have the possibility of overcoming not just exploitation and alienation, but also the whole range of oppressions that exist in our society, from the oppression of gender, the racial oppression, which have a great deal to do with how this underpaid or unpaid labor is assigned to people, and the oppressive and private context in which it's carried out. So those are the internal social relations of the commune. You mentioned a cooperative. A cooperative is a markedly less ambitious project, not only because most cooperatives go on producing principally for the market. They have no other choice because they are in a capitalist society. So internally, they cannot create the same directly social labor. They can't join production and consumption. They can't overcome the hierarchy between so-called productive labor and reproductive labor. But the other thing about Venezuelan communes, and this is kind of the elephant in the room, is that Venezuelan communes are part of a strategic socialist project. And that is an extraordinary situation, an extraordinary achievement of the Bolivarian process, which allows means that a commune isn't an isolated project, but is part of a strategic network of communes that aims to hegemonize the whole economy and also overcome the capitalist state form. So that makes it a much more ambitious project, a project for transforming the whole society on a national level, and one hopes also internationally.
I like that you use that word ambitious. I was reading some of the book, and you talk about this. Communal systems are more sustainable, less destructive and alienating, and in many senses more humanly gratifying. And you're talking about how not only is this a space where we can kind of imagine a non-capitalist mode of production, but also a space to respond to those different and various intersecting oppressions that humans do experience. And I know that much of the left, especially this English-speaking left, the left that lives and organizes inside the belly of the beast, is desperately searching for these alternatives, this idea of what socialism can really look like and how that can actually, open the door to resisting oppressions. But I find that much of this same left doesn't seem to focus or even talk much about communes in Venezuela. So would you say that your book is an effort to correct that, to hopefully get people to talk more, to focus on the possibilities that communes have, particularly in the experience of the Venezuelan Revolution? And ideally, what would you say you would like people to take away from the text after reading it?
Well, that question is absolutely on the mark. One thing I often say about the text, I like to quote Marx. Marx said in Latin, and he said, "De te fabula narrator," when he was speaking about capital. And that, I guess, in Latin means this is a story about you. So Marx was saying to German readers who might be thinking, why should I be interested in English capitalism? Because that's the subject. That's the material example taken in Capital. Why should I be reading this book about English capitalism? Well, I would say the same thing to my readers around the world. What if they ask the question, why should I be reading about Venezuela and their communal project? And I would say, well, this is a story about you. It's a story about what can be done in one's own context. Of course, changing the changeable, adapting to one's context. And I think, as you were pointing out, there's a great deal of Eurocentrism in the left that has many, many manifestations. One of the ones that I find frequently is that people always talk, leftists, my friends, many of them, always focus on the Russian Revolution, but pay very little attention to the Chinese Revolution or the Vietnamese Revolution. But these were extraordinary revolutions, and they continued and criticized the Soviet process, and I believe contributed to what one say the universal body of socialist thought. So the same thing goes for Venezuela. I'd like to say what's being done in Venezuela is a story that pertains to its hypothesis about socialist construction that should be evaluated and should be thought of as a contribution to the universal body of socialist thought. When I say universal, I just mean because capitalism is universal. I don't mean to say it's from a certain positionality. I just mean that all of us face capitalism, and therefore overcoming capitalist relations is a general project that people face around the world today. So I hope people will pay attention to what's written in the book, or more importantly, what's taking place in Venezuela, the most interesting parts of it. And that's what we believe, is that the communal project is the most interesting advanced part of what's going on in Venezuela, and people should pay attention to it.
Well, I'm really grateful for you having written this book and helping to correct that record, helping to shine a spotlight on what's happening. I know that's what we try to do at Venezuelanalysis as well. So I invite all our listeners to also check out our website and the work of Chris, which is often featured on the site, but everybody else here at the team at Venezuelanalysis, where we try to do our best to also, share about what's happening inside the country, precisely with that aim, so that people can understand that there is a lot to be learned from this, that we can go from the particular to the general in this case, and hopefully be able to apply that to their domestic circumstances, because the world needs us to be better organized and to learn from these experiences. And again, I think your book here is a valuable contribution to that effort. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add before we cut away.
Well, maybe I'll mention the title again, Commune or Nothing. It's kind of vernacular here. It's the most common slogan of the movement. Someone would say it's an obvious title for the book, but I actually want to point to, among the many dimensions of that slogan, there's an existential slogan. In the multi-crisis we're facing today, which includes an economic crisis, but also an environmental crisis, I think that if we do not act, if we do not attempt to build an alternative, we might be facing the nothing. So the Communal project here also has an ecological dimension. I was talking about directly social labor. Directly social labor is about producing not exchange values, but use values, and producing use values with in view of a particular need of someone. And that kind of production is necessarily limited, rationally limited. So there's also an important, essential ecological promise built into the Venezuelan commune. And that's part of what Commune or Nothing is. All of us hope that here that we'll choose a communal communist future instead of the nothing that might await us.
Thank you so much. We've been speaking with Chris Gilbert, author of Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project, available from Monthly Review.
Thanks very much, José Luis.
That's our program for today. For more on the issues explored, check out episode 18, Challenging the Bipartisan Imperialist Consensus on Venezuela, episode 16, The Imperialist Plunder of Venezuelan Assets, and episode 13, Solidarity versus Sanctions. A final word. An economic turnaround in Venezuela will take time. The impact of the sanctions easing will likely not really be felt by the Venezuelan population before the presidential vote, scheduled for late 2024. This is, of course, by design. The U.S. is placing its bets on the opposition winning the election, and the White House wants to make it as easy as possible for them. An economic recovery, driven by this sanctions easing, would allow Maduro and the United Socialist Party of Venezuela to, correctly, say that the economic crisis was a product of the sanctions. It's the same reason why the $3 billion deal signed last November between the government and the opposition never really materialized. Nonetheless, there will be some immediate effects. Venezuela will no longer need to work with intermediaries to export oil, which had meant selling crude at significant discounts while also facilitating corruption, as was exposed earlier this year. Venezuelan economist Francisco Rodriguez predicts that based on recent oil prices and assuming current production levels, the sale of Venezuelan oil at market rates would mean an extra $3.6 billion of yearly revenue for the government. The easing of sanctions is to be celebrated, but it would be a step too far to call this the end of sanctions. There is still a long way to go. Be sure to visit us at Venezuelanalysis.com for regular news and analysis on all things Venezuela. We're also everywhere on social media, from Telegram to Instagram and, of course, Twitter. If you enjoyed the program, please share it with your friends. We'll end today's episode with the song El Imperio Mismo by Iskra.
Occasionally have to twist the arms of countries.
From Russia to China to Venezuela.
Este es un país en el que el secretario de Defensa sale en la televisión y le dice tranquilamente al público que esto lo hacemos por la libertad, no por el petróleo.
Esta es la tierra de la libertad y la patria de los valientes.
Tierra de libertad y el hogar de los valientes. Los anglo-estadounidenses heredaron de Inglaterra su vocación imperial y con la guerra mantienen el control hegemónico, político, estratégico, económico, posicionándose para el intercambio atómico y de modo irónico usan la ONU y sus ONGs para poner al mundo a sus pies, violando diplomáticamente la soberanía, que no viole bajo la mesa la CIA, perfeccionando cada día sus apologías y su política colonialista y usando su pueblo como el instrumento para su conquista, formando su imperio a base del engaño de los medios, su conflagración y su jueguito de Nintendo y su película de acción que nuestra mente siembra en su idea y cosecha nuestra dominación, manteniéndonos anestesiados con el sueño americano. Gracias a la pesadilla de los pueblos latinoamericanos te hacen ver el hambre y la guerra como algo lejano y nos han tenido 100 años acostumbrados a su combate por recursos naturales para las transnacionales y difunden sus discursos o sus dislates por sus imperios comunicacionales disfrazando la guerra de intervención, el principal producto de exportación de su ministerio de agresión, no de defensa. Bolívar mantiene vigencia, los Estados Unidos están destinados por la providencia para plagar la América de miseria con su injerencia. Vienen por ti, por querer ser independiente. Vendrán aquí por nuestros recursos, no por nuestro presidente. No tienen una guerra aquí porque están ocupados en el Medio Oriente. Vienen por ti, por querer ser independiente. Vendrán aquí por nuestros recursos, no por nuestro presidente. No tienen una guerra aquí porque están ocupados en el Medio Oriente y separando el mundo entre los malos y los buenos. La maquinaria propagandística está preparando el terreno con series y juegos alusivos a nosotros. Los países canalla preparan para mandar a la batalla. Las mentes de los soldados rayan para que se hagan presentes donde la injerencia y el financiamiento no sea suficiente. Otra estrella más para su bandera, otra raya más para la cebra. Otra vez que se limpian el culo y echan en la papelera los tratados de Ginebra. Otro casus belli sospechoso, otra matriz que lo coloca como victorioso. Discusión irrelevante, porque para quienes inventan la guerra lo importante no es si son derrotados o si salen triunfantes. Lo que importa es que la guerra dure bastante, porque lo que para nosotros suena kaboom, para el Pentágono suena chiclín. Lo que para nosotros es perder la autodeterminación, para ellos significa coronar un botín. Y no tiene limitación la alienación de un sector de la oposición que piden a gritos una invasión, como si los mercenarios y los bombardeos humanitarios distinguieran a los escuálidos y a los revolucionarios. Sus objetivos son eliminar los subversivos, saquear y implantar su pobre cultura a los nativos.
Venezuela, that was some mean bush.
We need to talk about a greater Venezuela.
Maduro, SUV. They're worrying about the civil unrest in Venezuela.
It's Chavez, the guy who called America a terrorist state.
Todo empezó hace 12 años. La Federación amenazaba a toda Sudamérica.
Venezuela has no ties to Iran, but that Iran has a clandestine nuclear program that could potentially spread to the southern hemisphere.
¡El petróleo! ¡Trágate eso! ¡Listen! ¡Take it!
Rourke convenció a Washington para que dejara a los Ghosts resolver el problema.
Venezuela has been trying to form a bloc with Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba to counter U.S. dominance in the region.
Estados Unidos envió una fuerza de invasión para destruir a la Federación.
That these countries become a training and launching ground for Al-Qaeda.
In Venezuela?
Él es vicepresidente de un poderoso estado, de un poderoso imperio, y yo soy presidente de un poderoso contraimperio que es Venezuela.
Iskra, la amenaza comunista. Y desde el imperio mismo, first en el beat. Expropiese.
No habrá piedad para nadie. ¡Registren la zona!
Quienes dirigieron el imperio estadounidense siempre consideraron la independencia del sur como una amenaza a su apetito imperial de apoderarse de nuestras tierras, de nuestras riquezas, como parte del destino manifiesto. No es nuevo que nos declaren amenaza. Miserables, balurdos. Y este es el pueblo de los libertadores, este es el pueblo de Simón Bolívar. Esta es tierra sagrada que no puede ser tocada por bota extranjera, por bota imperialista, jamás. Y debemos garantizarlo con nuestra propia vida si es necesario. Venezuela es sagrada y Venezuela se respeta.